Welcome to another episode of Yu-Gi-Oh! Player Ranks. In this series, we rank various Yu-Gi-Oh! Themes based on your comments and suggestions. Come back every tier list Tuesday to see an all-new installment of this series. Alright, what's up guys? We have a brand new video today. We're doing a tier list for Master Duel. So much has happened. New pack, new ban lists, multiple ban lists. We have a bunch of information from the World Championship qualifier. We have a bunch of information for recent tournaments. So we can definitely make a tier list that actually makes sense, because I was waiting for some new information to drop to make sure that this was very accurate. But yes, let's start off as soon as possible. And if there's anything that I missed, because again, there's so many archetypes in Yu-Gi-Oh! If there's anything that I missed, mention in the comment section down below. Either I or one of the commenters or subscribers will give you an accurate representation of where that deck should go. So if there's a deck I missed, just say it down below, and someone will get back to you. But right off the bat, we have Tyramids. This is tier 1 still. It is the greatest deck ever made. Tyramids Shizu is the greatest deck Konami has ever made. The deck is insane. It can play through almost just about anything. It can play through floodgates. It can play through floodgates. It can play through bricks. What's crazy about this deck is it can even play through Maxi, because if it gets Maxi'd, you just end your turn and then do all of the Tyramids stuff on your opponent's turn. Like, the deck is insane. You can play on either player's turn, which is just it's crazy. It's got so many combo starters. It's really honestly one of the greatest decks ever made. It has so many outs to things. It has a counter trap. It's a card that books things. It has a card that negates effects on the field. That is, you can do it every single turn because it's a continuous trap card. It has so many different card starters. All of the mermaids, all are combo starters. Scream is a combo starter, which is their continuous spell. Like, the deck has all of their traps, all of their fusion monsters, all start up the engine. Like, it's unbelievable how good this deck is. And then of course you've got the Ichizu cards. And when you really think about it, this version of Tyramids that we have right now is the best deck in the game, and it is extremely severely hit. It is very severely hit. All of the Ichizu, almost all of the Ichizu stuff is limited to 1. A bunch of the Tyramids stuff is either limited to 1 or semi-limited. It's crazy to even imagine. Like, imagine Tyramids at absolutely full power, like everything at 3. Like how far of a tier 0 deck would that be? I mean, it's already insane. It's already a tier 1 deck, and on top of that, they've had to hit like terraforming. They've had to hit like King of the Swamps, which was honestly they didn't need to hit, but they hit it anyway. Like, all of the subsidiary cards that they've had to hit this deck. So on top of the Tyramid cards, in-archetype cards, on top of the the in-archetype Tyramid cards, on top of the Ichizu cards, they've also hit a bunch of cards surrounding it, like instant fusion and terraforming and all of this other stuff. They've hit so many different cards just to make this deck tier 1. Not tier 0, but tier 1. That's how good this deck is. Absolutely insane. Still the best deck. If you're going to put your gems anywhere and you only want to win, and that's the only thing you care about, you put all of your gems into Tyramids. Next, Adamemancipator is probably like a rogue deck now. It's just very tough to compete. This deck basically, as always, it makes a monster that's unaffected by everything. Ignisters, of course. Ignisters make a deck that is unaffected by everything, which is good. And then it has like graveyard negates, which is a little odd to even describe, but basically they're like monsters in the graveyard, and they offer like protection and negates, stuff like that. Really not good to play against when you talk about the Ichizu shufflers. Also, some of the monsters are light and dark, so unfortunately everyone is main decking Beastials right now, because Beastials are like a DD Crow on steroids. So everyone's main decking Beastials. And the issue with everyone main decking Beastials is that unfortunately it does hurt just your normal plays when you're playing Ignisters. Next is Dinosaurs. I'd say Dinosaurs probably, again, somewhere in Rogue. It's just really tough to compete right now. Again, Dinosaurs are a good deck, either going first or going second, depending on what build you want to make. The problem is the grind game right now is very harsh in Yu-Gi-Oh! And it's very tough to actually OTK your opponent, just because, again, like when you're playing against a deck like Tyramids, or you're playing against a deck like Sprites, or one of the better decks in the game, or Despia, the problem is it's tough to OTK those decks because they have so much like grind game. And the problem is you won't be able to OTK them, and on the follow-up turn, they're going to be able to rebuild their board as if you've never even tried to OTK them. And then going first, You can build a fairly strong board with this, but DD Crow really hurts this deck, and all of the hand traps that are used against Tyramids are unfortunately really good against Dinosaurs. You really don't want your graveyard interacted with, because that's one of the best ways to stop Dinosaurs. Because on field, your Dinosaurs have things like Miscellaneous Source, so you can protect your stuff on field. The problem is the graveyard is really where it can be a little bit tough. In the graveyard is where they can DD Crow you and stuff like that, and that's kind of where the issue is. So the hand traps that they use against Tyramids unfortunately hurt Dinosaurs. But overall, it's still like a higher tier rogue deck. Sprite is either, now you gotta listen, it's either tier 2 or tier 1, depending on like what kind of tournament results you look at, but it's definitely up there. I would almost say it's a tier 1 deck. It almost doesn't have any real hits. It has a couple, like a handful of hits, and it got hit a little bit on the ban. Like I think one of the cards got like semi-limited or something like that. But the deck is good for a variety of reasons. It can main deck the Beastials, no problem. On top of that, this deck can actually main deck Dimensional Shifter, which a lot of people in the World Championship qualifier event just last month, a lot of them were actually playing. They switched from tier limits to Sprites with D-Shifter, because Sprite with D-Shifter is just very good. If your stuff gets banished, it's not the end of the world. Yeah, but Sprites Sprites are actually quite good with D-Shifter and a variety of other cards like it. But definitely Sprite is 100% somewhere on par with tier limits, because the positive thing about tier limits is sometimes, because so many cards on tier limits are hit on the ban list, sometimes they can get they're gonna have a little bit of trouble starting up their engine, whereas with Sprites they don't have any trouble starting up their engine. The deck is very, very consistent. It's much more, the deck is more consistent than tier limits, but tier limits has a higher ceiling than Sprite, and that's usually why in most games, in most situations, tier limits will beat Sprite. But Sprite is just such a consistent deck. Like every single time, as long as you have like 2 level 2s, you basically make a full Sprite board, whereas with tier limits, you kind of have to hope that you have good mills. Sometimes you have crappy mills, and when you have crappy mills and kind of like the roll of the dice doesn't go your way, sometimes it can end a little awkwardly. But this can always end on an excellent board. Essentially, any 2 level 2s will typically get you to a full Sprite board, whereas with this, it's like sometimes you whiff a little bit on the mills. Next, we've got Despia. Despia is a solid, like, top of tier 2 deck. Despia is good. It's a very interesting deck in that it's been meta relevant. For example, it's been meta relevant in the OCG for almost like 2.5 years. And it seems like the deck goes through a major metamorphosis. Every 3 months, they release support that changes the way the deck is played. So in Master Duel, the most recent releases were the Beastials, and that significantly changed the way the deck is played, because by releasing them, the deck used to very heavily just rely on a Brand of Fusion. Like, Brand of Fusion was everything. You activated Brand of Fusion, if it got ashed, you probably lost. If it didn't get ashed, you probably won. That was branded. It had a very good grind game, very resilient. That was branded. That's why Aluber went to 2. That's why Branded Opening went to 2. The entire deck was predicated on getting to Branded Fusion. That's the entire deck. But with the Beastials, the deck has really changed, because now it has a lot more of a grind game. It can play during your opponent's turn. You can fuse using there are other ways to fuse, like for example, the Blazing Cartesia is your way to fuse. You can use a field spell to fuse. Like, you can use a lot of different ways now to fuse, and you have other interruptions from Lubellion and the Beastials, and you have a real strong opportunity to actually compete with tier limits, because naturally the Beastials are just really good against the tier limits, because they activate the fusion summon, you activate a Beastial, you special summon, and then you get to search, and then you get to search another Beastial, which is really, really good. And then Lubellion is a strong card, because he gets to search any Beastial, and then he can bring himself back, and then activate a branded continuous spell from the deck, like directly from the deck. It just puts it into play, so you can activate a trap card directly, place it onto the field. But yeah, it's just, this deck has gotten significantly better. And what's crazy about this deck is it's not even in its final version, which I think is one of the scariest parts about the deck. Is like, the deck has probably, I don't know when we'll get it, but probably in another 6 months we'll get even more branded support to make it an even stronger deck. So it's a very interesting deck that continues to kind of float around the top of the metagame, and I think that's exactly where it will remain. It's probably one of the better decks right now, and having the Bestials available is very good. The problem is, I'd say the biggest problem with this deck is it definitely doesn't have as good of a ceiling as Tyramids, and it definitely isn't as consistent as Sprites. And also, the Bestials themselves actually really hurt this deck. So, in addition to being able to play them and search them in the deck, that's all great, but they're also... the issue is you can, play and search the Bestials, but they're also very good against you. Because if you use, like, Branded and Red, for example, and your opponent Bestials you, well, now you can't Fusion Summon. It's kind of like a dead search. Next is Pure Adventure. Don't play Pure Adventure. Number one, Pure Adventure always sucked, but on top of that, the Adventure engine is very, very severely neutered in Master Duel, and I don't think any deck right now is even playing the Adventure engine. Any good deck is really playing it. The only thing I've seen is maybe like Mech Adventure, but again, the problem with Adventure engine is that at this point, you're playing more bricks than you're playing starters. And when you're playing more bricks than starters, it's just not going to end well. So I would probably avoid the pure deck, and as an engine, it's really fallen off. Next, we've got, this is either tier 2 or tier 3. This is Exo Sisters. Exo Sisters is basically a deck that is really good against any graveyard deck. When it doesn't play against a graveyard deck, it's still very good because it can banish like so many cards in a turn, like everything. It's incredible. It has like 4 banishes a turn, and it's very good against graveyard decks. So the deck is really actually quite strong. I'd say, and the good thing is having Martha, for example. Just before Martha, the deck was a good deck, but with Martha, the deck is kind of like really strong because it's the only one that can prompt a graveyard movement and then basically start your engine in a certain sense. But it's either tier 3 or tier 2. As this tier list kind of fills itself in, I'll move it around. It might actually be a tier 2 deck. This is definitely a tier 2 deck. This is Philanderies. Now, here's the problem with Philanderies. The new Super Poly target is actually really good. So Garuga is a brand new card, just came out, really good against Philanderies. It basically cracks their entire end board. When they end on the M-Pen, and for example, they have like M-Pen and Ryza, you can easily just Super Poly that away now. This deck is still really good because it can still main deck Dimensional Shifter. It can still main deck a bunch of floodgates like Macrocosmos, Dimensional Fissure, stuff like that. Dimensional Shifter can still be main decked. It still has an inherent advantage in Master Duel where Max C does nothing against this deck, and everyone is playing Max C. Like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's probably the card that since day one, everyone has played in every single deck. The only deck people didn't play it in is if they're like Infernoids, for example, because you don't want to accidentally hit it off the... you don't want to hit your Max C off of like a Reasoning or something like that. But other than that, literally every deck has pretty much played Max C since day one in every single deck. It's probably one of the most integral cards in the entire game, and it's a total waste against this deck. So it has that inherent advantage. On top of that, like, again, the deck is considerably more skill based than it was a few months ago, because obviously with the barrier statue, you used to be able to just summon a barrier statue and just sit on that, and your opponent would either be able to out that barrier statue or not, and the game would basically end based on that. But now the deck takes considerably more skill. Another positive part about this deck is everyone is basically main decking the Bestials. They're main decking the Bestials, and they're main decking Max C. Both the Bestials and Max C do absolutely nothing against this deck. This entire deck is all wind and like 2 water monsters. So none of those do anything. So you're talking about maybe 25% of a person's deck not doing a single thing against your deck. Like, they're literally dead cards against your deck. On top of that, you have built-in anti-meta like cards that are very, very strong. So Philanderies, for that reason, is definitely like a tier 2 deck, and depending on the matchup, it could, like most matchups, especially up here, it's built to beat most of the decks in the top, so it could easily be even higher. I think this should be here too, though. Now that I'm thinking, Exo Sisters should probably be here. Labyrinth is one of the better trap decks. I'd say it's probably like tier 3, almost tier 2. It's the best trap deck in the game. So if you really like trap cards, this is the best deck to play. it's still waiting for another wave of support, which is the Lovely Lady and the Big Welcome Labyrinth. I don't know when that will come to Master Duel, but Master Duel is such an odd thing sometimes. Like, it's so odd that certain cards haven't even been released in the TCG, but they're already in Master Duel. Like, for example, there's like a Blackwing there's a Blackwing monster in the new deck that is in Master Duel, but it's not in the TCG yet. And then there's stuff that we're just waiting for almost endlessly. They just kind of sprinkle it little by little by little by little in packs. So I don't know when we'll get the new support, but this deck is definitely one of the better trap decks. This is Lightsworns. I'm going to put Lightsworns and consider building something else. Just because Tearlament is in every single way a better Lightsworn deck. It is exactly what Lightsworns needed, but they just gave it to an archetype full of mermaids. It is seriously, like, if they just took the Tearlament monsters and replaced their names with Lightsworn, Lightsworn would have been a tier 0 deck. It would have been a tier 1 deck. The problem with Lightsworns is the ceiling on the monsters is just so low, and you have to put such a huge investment cost just to mill like 2 cards, and then Tearlaments mill like 15 cards a turn without even thinking, which is kind of like insane. The best Lightsworn monster, for example, is Raiden. Raiden mills 2 cards. That's it. It just mills 2 cards. The Shizu cards mill 5 cards. All they have to do is just send to the graveyard. They mill 5 cards. The best Lightsworn only mills 2. It's just a little bit too aged. That's probably the best way to describe it. It's much too aged of an archetype, and it needed some better modern support, some better special summons. Right now, it's literally in every way a worse version of Tearlaments, except they're light. Also, Beastials wreck this deck because Wolf gets sent to the graveyard, activate Wolf to special summon, Beastial. Never fun. Next is Raid Raptors. Probably it's a rogue deck. It's got a lot of light, a lot of dark monsters. The whole archetype is dark. It's got decent cards available to you, but the Beastials are also very good against this deck. Context matters, in Yu-Gi-Oh. If people are playing Droll, it's not a good time to play a deck that searches a bunch. If people are playing Beastials to counter Tearlaments, it's not a good time to play heavy dark decks unless they themselves can basically play around it. So I'd say probably around Rogue status. Eldlich it's rough. I honestly put high Rogue for Eldlich. Oh my god, Beastials are atrocious the Beastials are outrageously good against Eldlich. It's unbelievable how good the Beastials are against Eldlich, because Eldlich is a light monster. You activate Eldlich to send a card on the field to the graveyard, they Beastial your Eldlich, and it's over. It's pretty much over, because you put so much effort into putting Eldliches into play, and if they banish 3 Eldliches, like, the deck can't do anything. On top of that, they've hit so many different floodgates that every time they hit a floodgate, this deck becomes weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker and weaker, and they have just continued to hit floodgates one after the other. So at this point, I think the deck is Rogue, might even be lower than that. Like, it's just so tough to play. Number 1, not enough floodgates. Number 2, again, the Beastials are very good against this particular deck. Next is the Insect deck, the Bee Troopers. This deck is kind of like bottom half of Rogue. It's just the problem with this deck is the ceiling is like non-existent. Like, it has so much cool combo potential, but you end on like a Cicada King, and like what is this deck doing? Like, the insects need better boss monsters. This stupid fusion is like unaffected on the turn that it's summoned, or like the 2 turns, and then it becomes a regular like monster afterwards. So it's unaffected, then it's not unaffected anymore. Why? I've never seen that. Why is there an expiration on a monster being unaffected, especially when it requires 4 insect monsters to make? I mean, it's unbelievable. I have no idea why the ceiling on this deck is just so low. It's got like the opposite problem of Tearlament. Tearlament has an incredible ceiling, but sometimes you have a little bit of trouble. Like once in a while, you have one of those games where you like mill and you don't you whiff. You don't mill anything useful, and you can't get your combo started. This deck is incredibly consistent, but like, where are you really headed? Like, the end boards are embarrassing. It's like, on best case scenario, it's like a scary moth and a cicada king. It's like, what the deck just is very, very the ceiling is just very, very low. The good thing is there's not a lot of dark monsters, so Bestials don't hurt it. This is Gokeys. Gokeys are like a cool deck. It has a monster that's unaffected by everything, but it's actually unaffected by everything forever, which is really cool, as long as it's link summoned. Unlike this, it's a cool deck, but I wouldn't say it's like broken or anything. The Monarchs are, you know, like a tribute summon deck. I wouldn't say it's like too great of a deck. Bestials are pretty decent against it, but not like outrageously good against it. It can play around Max C, but not as well as other tribute summon decks. Like, in every way, honestly, I'm going to put it and consider building something else, because if we're being honest, Philanderies is just a better tribute summon deck in every single conceivable way. Even True Dracos are like a better tribute summon deck in every way, unfortunately. We've got, this is probably like a tier 3, maybe even rogue deck. This is DDDs. DDDs are in a rough spot right now. It sucks because you would think the most intelligent human beings on Earth are busy building rockets or developing software. They're not. The most intelligent human beings on Earth are actually playing DDDs. This deck takes an incredible amount of skill to pilot, and unfortunately it just got significantly harder. Between the Ishizu Shufflers and the Bestial banishing cards, this deck is just really rough to play. On top of it, they do fusion summon out of the graveyard a lot like Tyramids, but again, it's very easy to interrupt and they're hard ones per turns. So it's tough to play this deck. But the good thing about this deck is it's another one of those decks like Tyramids where it just has a very, very high ceiling. So if you can start your combo, the game is pretty much over. But the problem is sometimes it can be a little bit rough to get into it. Also, their Link Monster is just absolutely so good. Like, the deck used to be, before the Link Monster came out, the deck used to be like all around summoning Sync, Crystal Wing, and like all of this goofy stuff. And now the deck is pretty much like, okay, we'll lock ourselves into DDDs. Like, that's how good Link Monster is. They've accepted locking themselves into DDDs, and the deck is actually quite good. Very high ceiling, but sometimes it can be a little rough to get started, especially in an inhospitable meta like we have right now. Next is, this is Avoid at All Costs. This is Familiar Possessed. It's basically a spellcaster floodgate archetype, where basically the entire objective of the deck is the main deck monsters don't do anything at all, but you have some powerful spawn and trap cards that give your monsters recursion, allow your monsters to spam themselves onto the board, they boost their attack, all stuff like that. It can be mixed with the Fairy Tale archetype because they have similar stats where they can essentially search them. So in certain ways, the archetype has some cool resources. You can use Secret Village. Like, this is good, cool stuff about this deck. But I'd say the biggest issue with it is just weaker version. It's a weaker version of a lot of other spellcaster archetypes, because the problem is the monsters themselves don't actually do anything. It's basically the spells and the traps actually doing something. But a lot of people love the artwork, so for that reason, a lot of people, you'll see more people play it than probably should. Next is Neos. Neos is probably like a rogue deck. We're still waiting for Air Neos to be released, but there's actually some new support that came out. Again, this is actually significant, really, really odd. So we got some new support, which is the Armed Dragon Neos monster. Incredibly odd. It's like the Rainbow Dragon Neos monster, because Neos fused with a lot of things, a lot of different things in the GX anime. But again, it's incredibly odd that we got that support, because that hasn't even come out yet in the TCG. So now we have a card that has come out in Master Duel, it's come out in the OCG, but it hasn't come out in the TCG. And then a lot of other archetypes here, like the Despia stuff. We have Despia stuff that's come out in the OCG, come out in the TCG, hasn't come out in Master Duel. Like, it's such a weird system where so many different things get released in so many different places, and sometimes you'll see a deck online, you're like, I'm really excited about playing that, and then you go to play it and it's like, oh, this card isn't in the TCG, or this card is not in Master Duel yet. And it's such an odd situation. Like, sometimes they'll be like, oh, I built this really cool deck on Master Duel, but you can't play it in TCG because they don't have a card available. It's really, really odd, but overall I'd say the deck is somewhere in Rogue. Armed Dragon is a pretty cool card, but now you have to add an additional brick into your deck, which is an Armed Dragon monster, into your Neos deck. But overall I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Next is this is Fortune Ladies. Again, it's in one of those spellcaster archetypes that just aren't really that great. I'd say it's probably somewhere like near Familiar Possessed, where it's like we just have better spellcaster archetypes available to us. So if you really wanted to play it, you can play it, but I wouldn't recommend it. It's just the deck has a very, very low ceiling. Most of them, unfortunately, Fortune Ladies were written in that time in Yu-Gi-Oh! It's a weird time frame in Yu-Gi-Oh! Because a lot of early Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards are really broken, and a lot of newer Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards, like just came out in the last few years, are really broken. But there was a time frame in Yu-Gi-Oh! In probably like the GX era, the 5Ds era, where there's just a lot of like bad cards. Like, they're just bad. Like, they just don't do much. Like, and this is one of those archetypes. Like, it's kind of like Ice Barrier and Flamevell and like all of those archetypes that just don't do much. This is one of those archetypes that are just, they were written, and it's almost like Konami just didn't care about whether they were going to be good or not. They just wanted to print cards that were just acceptable. This is Adamemancipator. I'd say it's probably like a tier 3 deck. It has very, very high combo potential still. It plays pretty well against the Beastie cards because it doesn't play a lot of dark monsters, so it's not a big deal. Your graveyard's not going to be destroyed quite as much, but the Achievous Shufflers do still hurt this deck because they can put back, for example, the Block Dragon, which is now limited to 1. But the deck still has a lot of combo potential. It can still make very, very strong boards. Definitely a deck to watch out for. Next is Crystal Beasts. Crystal Beast is an odd deck. It's either top of Rogue or bottom of tier 3. It's probably like bottom of tier 3 just because this deck has a lot of options. It really does. It has D-Shifter, which is always available. It has Macrocosmos available. It has all of the floodgates, like There Can Only Be One, still available. The deck has a lot of different really strong weapons that are really good against the metagame. So for that reason, this deck is just really powerful. And it doesn't really have any weaknesses per se. It just, sometimes the ceiling on this deck is just a little bit low. It's like sometimes the deck ends on like Baguska Pass, or it'll be like Baguska Pass with like a Necro Valley, and that's about it. And if they can out those two things, they basically have outed your board. Or it can make like a Baguska plus a There Can Only Be One, which again is pretty good, but like it's a little bit weak. It's like you have two forms of Floodgate, and if your opponent can out those two forms of Floodgate, it basically is over for you, because you're not going to be able to, like, okay, they out those two Floodgates, end their turn, and you just like build this incredible board. But I mean, what is good is that you can put up two Floodgates, and then the following turn you can almost always OTK them because you have Zenith, and Zenith is a very, very strong card that can almost always help you OTK between. Yeah, because Zenith is 3,000, and then it's just a very, very, very strong card. Next is Tunes. Tunes is, I can't say that it's considered building something else. I can't even say it's Rogue. I just don't think it's a very strong deck, if I'm being honest with you. It's only in consider building something else. It's definitely not an avoid at all costs, because it's not like one of those decks that's like really, really, really bad. I'd say it's probably in consider building something else because it's just not that strong of a deck, and it doesn't have a lot of interruptions. That's the problem with Tunes. It has protection, it has search power, but it just, once you can search stuff, you can protect things, but it doesn't really have a lot of really good interaction. Like, it has a counter trap, but it's okay. It has a way to, it has a Snatch Steal, but that's only going second. Going second, you can't really OTK your opponent, because the issue is you can't attack your opponent until like a few turns go by. and except unless it's like Blackluster Soldier, but Blackluster Soldier is like a self-contradicting card where if you activate its effect you can no longer attack. It's just, the deck is Toons is just such a mess sometimes. I don't usually like to put things in consider building something else unless I have a suitable replacement. Like I could just tell you like, oh, don't play Toons, play like Adamemancipator instead, but their playstyles are so different. There isn't a deck in the game that's like Toons, but there's a reason for that, because Toons are just not that good. So it's a little bit of a weird situation. Next is Pendulums. I'd say Pendulums probably like tier 3. It's a strong deck, not outrageously strong, but it's definitely a strong deck. Is it like, the good thing is the Beastials really don't do anything against Pendulums, because when Pendulums leave the field, they go to the extra deck anyway, so they never hit the graveyard regardless. So if things get banished, it's like whatever. I mean, not if they get banished, but like nothing ever hits the graveyard. So it's Shizu Shufflers, Beastial, stuff like that. They're never in the graveyard to get banished, so that part of your opponent's deck can be dead to a certain degree. So Pendulums can be actually quite good in that regard. They haven't been hit significantly in any way, and a lot of times if a Pendulum player wins a coin flip, they're pretty much going to win that duel unless you have a maxi. So for that reason I'd say it's probably tier 3. Heroes is probably like high rogue, very high rogue. It just continues, like Dark Law is just insane. What's his name? Phoenix Enforcer is still insane. Like both of those cards are really, really good, and they carry all of Heroes right now. It's like Plasma, DPE, and Dark Law. Those are the 3 main cards that just absolutely carry the archetype. And the problem is, if they can just get past those 3 cards, they pretty much win. The other issue with Heroes right now is obviously, again, the Beastials, Banish Light and Darks. What are the best hero monsters? What did I just say? Dark Law, dark. Dark Law is dark. Plasma is dark. Malicious is dark. And what's his name? And Phoenix Enforcer is dark. All of the best hero monsters are dark. So as soon as they hit the graveyard, there's no follow-up. Like if DPE hits the graveyard, they banish the DPE. If Shadow Mist hits the graveyard, they'll banish Shadow Mist. If Malicious hits the graveyard, they'll banish the Malicious. Like it's just a really rough situation right now for them. But if you go first and you end like a Dark Law, it can be really tough for a lot of opponents to actually play against that. Next is Shaddoll. Shaddoll is probably like a rogue deck. I wouldn't actually recommend playing Shaddolls right now, but here's the positive thing. You can play the Shaddolls in the tier limit deck if you're really obsessed with Shaddolls. And honestly, they're really, really good in the tier limit deck, because you can actually make Winda on your opponent's turn, which is just insane. Like you wait for your opponent to do like normal summon or special summon, you activate screen, banish some, mill some cards, fuse a Shaddoll plus a dark monster, and then you get a Winda, which is crazy to summon on your opponent's turn. Blue Eyes is like bottom half of Rogue. It's already a really rough deck to play. Konami just keeps, when they do make Blue Eyes support, it's very lackluster. And then on top of that, like the Beastials destroy Blue Eyes. Like they really, really, really absolutely destroy Blue Eyes. They can banish the stones, they can banish Sages, they can banish Blue Eyes, and most importantly, they can banish Jet. And if they banish Jet, you might as well not play, honestly. Next is Windups. I say Windups has decent combo potential, but I don't know if this is particularly the best meta to be playing Windups right now. I just think that a lot of the other decks are just so much more consistent and so much better generally, and they don't have to go first. Like Tyramids doesn't have to go first, Sprite doesn't have to go first, Despia doesn't have to go first. This deck pretty much has to go first to set up a really good board, whereas these decks can lose the coin flip and still play really well. Next is I'm going to put this in consider building something else. This is Witch. Honestly, the deck is just really small. Like the archetype is really small, and they created new support for it, but it essentially just does more of the exact same thing, which is it basically locks you into wins, and it summons basically win synchro monsters that are usually either level 10 or like you can make like your best board with this deck is like a Crystal Wing, and you make a Crystal Wing, maybe a Baron de Fleur, and you burn your opponent for 800 life points. Like the ceiling is just so low on this. This is better as an engine, but as of right now, there's really not a deck that can honestly utilize this completely. Like, you need a spell and trap card based deck, and then just summon a Crystal Wing. That's basically what it used to be. It used to be just an engine. You could, like, okay, I end on a Crystal Wing and I set 5. Like, that used to be the deck, and now it's become kind of power crap, to be honest with you. Phantasm Spirals is a top of tier rogue deck. Here are the positives. The deck is extremely cheap. It can pretty much play every floodgate known to man, because no floodgate affects his deck negative, like nothing. You can play Skill Drain, you can play D-Shifter, you can go second, you can main deck Lava Golem, you can do pretty much anything you want with this deck in terms of floodgates / going second board breaking cards, and that's the positive part about the deck. The other thing is Bestials do almost, like, not almost. Bestials do literally nothing against this deck, because your graveyard, number one, doesn't matter, and even if it did matter, there's maybe a Megalo Smasher in that graveyard, and honestly, like I said, the graveyard really doesn't matter at all. Now, one negative thing about this is that they actually hit Terraforming, which, if you don't draw the field spell with Phantom Spirals, you don't play the game. You just don't play. You don't do anything. That's kind of the problem with the deck. If you don't get to a field spell, you can't play. So, kind of an issue there. Now, they did put Metaverse to 2, which replaces the Terraforming in this deck, because Terraforming, it's not that Terraforming was that important, it's getting to your field spell. And Metaverse and Terraforming, they're interchangeable in this deck. It's not a big deal that you don't have like, this is one of those rare decks where it doesn't really matter whether you have Metaverse or Terraforming, and in some cases Metaverse is actually better in this deck, because you can help you, like, dodge spot destruction for the field spell. So overall, the deck is still in a very good place, because it's just so good against the metagame. It's one of those things where it's like Philanderies, where it's so different than the rest of the metagame that it doesn't really matter that others, like, it may lose a few things, but it can play so many different floodgates that it really doesn't matter that it lost a card or two. So the deck is really still in a strong place. It'll always really be in a strong place as long as there are floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh! But yeah, very, very strong rogue deck, and one of the cheaper good decks. Next is Infernoids. This is a little bit of a weird one to, like, rate. It always is, because sometimes the deck just wins. It's straight up, it's a sacky deck. It's a going second deck. You activate Reasoning, your opponent calls something, and you mill 15 cards. The deck, this game still has a lot of good, I guess, like, you could say, like, weapons for this deck, where it has, like, Reasoning, Monster Gate, all this stuff is still around. All of the milling, sometimes your opponent helps you mill, which is even better. So the deck is in a decent place. On top of it, it's fire monsters, so the Bestials don't really do anything against this deck, which is really good. So I'd say it's probably somewhere in rogue. Next is Subterror. Subterror is like not a tier 3 deck. It's probably some, like, a rogue deck. It's the best flip effect deck ever made, but unfortunately it's so, like, floodgate focused, and as they continue to take more and more floodgates, as they continue to put more and more floodgates onto the list, the deck will just continue to get weaker and weaker and weaker. It needs a boss monster like Dragoon, and I've said this the last, like, few lists. In the TCG, when this deck was at its best was when it had Dragoon. Honestly, even if it did have Dragoon, I don't think this deck would really be that good. I don't know why Dragoon's not in the game. I just don't have an answer for you, but it really should be. Next is, this is Spirals. Spirals is like a top of a rogue combo deck. It's a very strong combo deck. It's a very, very strong combo deck, and Illusion of Chaos definitely made this deck significantly better. But again, you have to ask yourself, like, what is better, like Tearlament or this deck? This deck, almost like, it has to go first to make it's a really, really good board. It has to go first. Whereas the thing with a deck like Tearlament is it can easily go second without any issues, and it can play on your opponent's turn. It can actually play on turn 0. You can build a Tearlament board if your opponent wins the coin flip, which is crazy to even think about. Whereas this deck has to wait until your opponent basically completes their board, and then it can actually start to play. So it's a little bit more of a classic combo deck, and it's definitely not as good as Tearlament. Also, it did lose a few things with Foolish Burial Goods going to Foolish Burial Goods going to 1 on the ban list because that used to be a card that was quite important in this deck. Terraforming is another deck that was card that was quite important in this deck because it helped get to Spiral Resort, stuff like that. Little hits, but those little hits actually hurt certain rogue decks. Next is Battery Man. This is a consider building something else card. Honestly, just play Thunder Dragons instead. Thunder Dragons are the second best Thunder archetype. Sprites are actually the best Thunder archetype. It's just it's just not that strong of an archetype. Very low ceiling. Element Sabers is a terrible deck. Every time I look at it, I'm just in shock that this deck was made in 2017 because the deck, you look at the deck and it looks like a deck printed in like 2007. Like that's how lackluster the deck is. Like the deck would have trouble winning a regional in 2007. Like that's how rough this deck is. It's a semi-modern archetype because technically yes, 6 years ago. So 6 years ago is like we had Firewall Dragon came out 6 years ago. One of those broken cards of all time. A Firewall Dragon with no errata came out 6 years ago. And then this came out after Firewall Dragon, and it is just such a terrible archetype. It's all focused around putting... Basically, your monsters gain additional effects when you have different monsters and different attributes in the graveyard. And they can change their own attributes in the graveyard. And it's just getting those monsters into the graveyard is probably the worst part of the archetype. Because it doesn't really facilitate any way to do it. There's no mill 5 cards, special summon, nothing like that happens in this archetype. So there's no way to put those monsters in the graveyard, and that's why it's kind of an iffy archetype. Next is Altergeist. It's a trap card based deck, all focused around spellcaster monsters. Overall, it's a strong deck, but I just don't think that it is like a broken archetype by any means. It's definitely one of those decks that's kind of like Power Craft. It used to be one of the best Link decks ever printed, but it's definitely past its prime. There is support that's scheduled to come out, including a really good Link 4 monster. We'll see what kind of meta impact it has, but it's tough to even judge it right now based on its new support, because honestly, most of these decks are going to get hits, so by then, I don't even know if it would be accurate to even try to figure that out. Next is Blackwings, just got a new structure deck. The deck is quite good. It's even got cards, like I said, that aren't even in the TCG yet that are in that structure deck, which is really cool. But overall, it's one of the better structure decks that we have had. I just don't think that it's enough to really... I don't think it's enough to compete with some of the newer archetypes. Also, the graveyard is semi-important, and Bestials running around is not good for this archetype. But overall, very high combo potential on this deck. But sometimes it can be a little bit of trouble kind of getting things started up. But definitely the combo potential on this deck is very, very high. Master is a very good card. He's a monster that's unaffected by activated effects, I believe, or unaffected by other effects. He steals a monster. On top of that, you have negates. The counter trap is really good. Like, there's really, really strong cards in this archetype. It's just a little bit harder to get started. This is Gravekeepers. Gravekeepers probably somewhere around Rogue. It's one of those decks that every single time, like, people talk about, like, oh, this is the metagame. This is when Gravekeepers are going to be good. And yes, Gravekeepers are good right now. If you go first, they're great. If you go first, you activate Necro Valley, you summon Supernaturalist from the extra deck, and you have protection over your Necro Valley and the Supernaturalist. And, like, yeah, it's a good board right now if you go first. But if you lose the coin flip, this deck is almost unplayable. Like, that's the problem with this deck. It almost does nothing when you lose the coin flip, because now you're, like, the entire deck is based around a field spell that is a floodgate that prevents your opponent and you from moving things from the graveyard, which is great it's great in a metagame where people use the graveyard. The problem is going second that is irrelevant because your opponent has already set up their board. What this deck really, really seriously needs is it needs a way, like a quick effect way to activate Necro Valley. That's the only way. Like, for example, Prime Banshee from the Zombie World archetype, the one where you can banish from the graveyard to activate a Necro Valley, or that effect, or you can banish from the field, activate a Necro Valley directly from your deck, or how Numerons have that monster where you can send it to the graveyard to activate a Numeron wall from the deck. Like, this deck needs something like that to be able to put Necro Valley up during your opponent's turn, because until this deck has that, it's not going to be a deck that makes sense. It's almost sad to see that Necro Valley is actually a more usable archetype. Necro Valley is a more usable field spell in other decks than it is in its own deck. Like, for example, in Crystal Beast, Necro Valley is a very good card in Crystal Beast because it's very easily searchable through that trap card with the graveyard effect. I forget its name, but it's more usable in decks like this than it is in its own native archetype, because other than Necro Valley, the deck is actually quite weak, and that's kind of the biggest issue with it. Next, FA. FA is a synchro based deck. I'd say it's probably in like the bottom of Rogue. It's all based around basically modulating the levels, and based on the levels you get all types of cool different effects. The best card in the archetype is probably Dragster, which is the spell and trap card negate. It used to be used significantly as a kind of like an additional level 7 negate that you could throw on board. It was a good card, but unfortunately the deck has just sort of been power crept over the years. Next is Magical Musketeers, which is probably like a rogue deck. What is cool about this deck is it, like, Bistials don't really hurt it. It doesn't really matter. Like, your graveyard doesn't really matter in this deck, so you could play stuff like D-Shifter, but I'd say the deck suffers from a weird issue where its Link Monster is its best card, but its Link Monster is only good going second. But the main deck is actually going first deck. So the deck is in a weird spot where, like you want to go first with the deck. You want to go first with the deck because you want your opponent to activate things in your Magical Musketeer columns, but then you don't get to use the Link Monster, which is a really good Link Monster, because the Link Monster is only useful going second. So it's in a weird spot. Next is Cyber Angels. I don't recommend playing Cyber Angels. It's just got a very low ceiling. Honestly, what are they called? Not Tritrons. Tritrons are honestly just, not only are they better as a ritual deck than Cyber Dragons, but not only are they better than Cyber Angels as a ritual archetype, but they also play some of the Cyber Angels. So honestly, you can kind of play like a blur between the two decks. Also, the best ritual deck in the game right now is Dogmatica. So if you're playing any ritual deck whatsoever, Dogmatica is definitely the way to go. Time Thieves is probably some like bottom rogue deck. As a pure deck, this deck isn't that good, but Time Thief Redoer is actually a very strong card, and I really recommend that you play this card in tier limits or any deck that can make a rank 4, because that card is really strong. Dragon Link, this is another interesting one. It's a very high skill deck, much like DDDs. I'd say it's probably top of tier 3, almost tier 2. And the reason I say this is because this deck is actually very it makes really imposing boards. It's, again, one of those decks that's just like a very high skill deck, and the important thing about this deck is that it actually did get better in this pack because it has the Bistials. The Bistials came out, and the Bistials are very good in this deck. They're all dragons, especially some of themselves, and then Bestial Magnamut, for example, searches any dragon, which is really awesome at the end phase. Really cool effect, and it can basically interrupt your opponent, give you a free dragon, and on top of that, give you a free search. So it's almost like a +3. It's kind of crazy because it stops something. It's a hand trap, free monster on board, and it searches. It's like really strong. On top of that, the new cards, the branded beasts, for example, which is the trap card for the Bistials, is actually better in Dragon Link than it is in its own native archetype. Because the problem with branded is sometimes some of the other cards in the archetype aren't dragons. So you have like a worm on board, so you can't tribute a dragon to pop your opponent's monster. You basically have to leave a Bistial on the field, or you have to leave Lubellion on the field in order to tribute to pop your opponent's card. But the good thing with Dragon Link is you're always going to have a dragon on the board. And then on top of some of the other branded continuous spells, like branded banishment, for example, is also very good in this deck, because whenever you banish a light or dark monster, you can put one of them back into the deck and then draw a card. Like that's just a really strong card in this deck. And then it can also help you recycle branded monsters, which is really cool. But overall, very strong deck right now. The big like hindrance to this deck is that, again, between these Shizu Shufflers and the Bestial cards, sometimes they can really actually hurt your deck, which is problematic. Like for example, you summon a Borload Savage Dragon, and then you target a Link monster like a Striker Dragon, or you can target a Link monster in your graveyard, and then your opponent banishes it with a Bestial. Like, that's never fun. Situations like that, for example, or you summon a Chaos Ruler, and then you activate the effect to mill, and then you go, okay, I want to add this card from my graveyard, and then your opponent banishes. Like, that kind of stuff is just really bad for this deck. This deck has a very, very high ceiling. I would argue this deck easily has a higher ceiling than all three of these decks right here, but it's a little bit more fragile and a little bit easier to stop. Like, it definitely has a higher ceiling / board than, for example, Philanderies. Like, Philanderies ends on like a Floodgate and an M-Pen and maybe like the trap card to summon a Rise on your opponent's turn. Like, yeah, it's like 3-4 interruptions, but this deck can legitimately end on like 8-9 interruptions. But the problem is, it's much easier to get to the 4 interruptions in Philanderies than it is to get to the 9 interruptions in Dragon Link, for example. It's just, there's more ways to stop it, unfortunately. So although it has a very high ceiling, sometimes it can be a little bit easy to interrupt, unfortunately. Next is Galaxy. This is another deck that's like very heavily negatively influenced by the Bestials, for example. Yeah, very negatively influenced by the Bestials because they're all light monsters. So they hit the graveyard, and then your opponent can just banish them, and then it kills all of your recursion plays, unfortunately. So it's like an interruption, and it gives your opponent a monster, and then it gives them plays the following turn. Like, it's really not good. One other thing that I'll say about Beastie, the Dragon Link deck, is just remembered it. It's just another cool thing about this deck is the Bestials are all level 6, which is really good for this deck because the tuners are all Dragon Link tuners are level 4. So you've got the level 4 Dragon Link tuners, and then you have the level 6 all the level 6 cards, so you can very easily get to Baron de Fleur. Like, your first play of the game could be Baron de Fleur, because on your opponent's turn, you activate like Bestial Magnum, banish a card. Then it comes to your turn, you summon a Rocket, and then you immediately go into Baron de Fleur. Before you've committed to any of the other crazy plays, you automatically summon Baron de Fleur, and now if your opponent has some sort of interruption, they have to contend with a negate on top of it. So while you're building your board, you have a negate available to you. It's just a really, really strong card there. Cyber Dragons is in a rough spot. It's a going second deck in a meta game with Ichizu Shufflers and Bestials. Not fun. Like, just very not fun. It's a terrible situation. Yeah, again, like, you have to go second because that's the deck functions best when it goes second. So you go second and you try to OTK your opponent, but as you're trying to OTK your opponent is banishing your core. They're banishing I'm sorry if I forget some of the names, but the card that sends an additional to the graveyard. If you summon Astra, you target a Cyber Dragon in the graveyard, they can banish it. If you summon a Cyber Dragon Nova, detach material, target a Cyber Dragon in the graveyard, they can banish it. Or they can shuffle it back with the Ichizu cards. So it's just very much not the best metagame to be playing this deck. Not only do you have to go second, which is already tough enough, but now it's like when there are cards that are naturally good against your deck, it's just tough to play. Next is Jinzo. Jinzo is just, it's an avoid at all costs, unfortunately. As much as I like this card personally, I have to be honest with myself, and I have to be honest with you guys. Sometimes it's just not the best deck. Look at the top like 10 decks that are over here. Out of all of the top 10 decks, we have one deck that's a trap card deck. That's it. One trap card deck. The majority are mid-range combo decks. So what exactly is Jinzo going to do against this? And on top of that, it's like, how would you even go about, like, the Jinzo archetype is like, yeah, it summons Jinzo, but most of these decks can't out the Jinzo without using their native trap cards. The only deck that Jinzo would actually be like significantly good against is probably Labyrinth, but Labyrinth has ways to pop Jinzo where it doesn't really matter. So yeah, I'd say it's avoid at all costs. It's just one of those cards that just unfortunately got power crept and is now at the bottom of any tier list. Next is Predaplants. Predaplants probably Sigma around Rogue. It's honestly better as an engine in fusion decks than it is in its own native archetype, which is hard to hear sometimes, but that is the state of the game, unfortunately, and that is the state of actually Shaddols. Shaddols are better in tier elements than they are in their own archetype, in the same way that Predaplants are better in Despia, for example, than they are in their own archetype. And basically, Predaplants have just become extra deck monsters. They just become the super poly target archetype. And as sad as it is, and I love the artwork, I love how cool it is, but unfortunately, that's just the nature of where it's headed, where this deck is basically headed. Next is Dragon Maids. Pure Dragon Maids is much too weak to be considered like tier 3, tier 2, tier 1. Fortunately, although I think it's too weak, because again, it's one of those decks that just has a really low ceiling. Pretty easy, pretty good like combo potential, but the ceiling is really low. It's like you summon like a Heretic Seal of Heavenly Spheres, you have the trap card face down that bounces, and then you have like maybe you summon the fusion monster, the one that the black dragon, I forget its name, but you summon maybe those three things, the trap card, the monster, and Heretic Seal. Like you end on that and maybe a hand trap in hand, and that is usually your best possible board, assuming nothing goes wrong. This deck is honestly better as a partial engine in Dragon Link, because in Dragon Link you can use the trap card, which is really good. You can use the Dragon Maid, the one that is wearing the black dress. Again, I forget the names, there's so many cards, but the one that is wearing the black dress, you can use her in Dragon Link as a combo starter, and she's very good. But as a pure deck, I think it's a little iffy. Honestly, if you have this deck, easily you can convert it into a very strong Dragon Link deck, and you can easily get to Diamond tier 1 or Legend or whatever the new thing is, but definitely a deck that's fallen off. Next, we've got Mathmech. Mathmech just recently got hit in the TCG. Mathmech is one of those decks I probably put in tier 3. It's a very good deck, but as long as Bestials are in the metagame, Mathmechs are going to have trouble, because Bestials are so good against Mathmech, because they do have, although they have different attributes, their best monsters are lights and darks. I forget, it's circular and diameter. I don't remember the exact ones. I think one's light, one's dark, and those are the best two. So when they activate Super Factorial, you Bestial, banish one of those two, and basically they can't make their XYZ material with 3 monsters. They make it, as much as possible, and now they're losing a ton of advantage. So as long as Bestials are good, this deck is going to be hindered. Now, the fortunate thing is, just a few months ago, this was the best deck in the game. So, it's not the end of the world. You had your time to have fun with it, just not as good of a deck as it used to be. Dark Magician is a rogue deck that is in the same spot as Blue Eyes and Eldlich and all of the other decks that are light and dark that rely on having a monster in the graveyard. This is really troublesome for Dark Magician, because the Bestials are really good against Dark Magician. Because if you have Rod in the graveyard and you want to trigger its effect to add it back to hand, they can Bestial. If you have a Dark Magician graveyard, you activate Eternal Soul, they can Bestial, banish the Dark Magician. And if they get rid of Dark Magician out of your graveyard, it's really tough to get Dark Magician back once it has been banished. You don't really have any in-archetype way to get Dark Magicians from the banish pile back into the graveyard or back into the deck within this archetype. So that can definitely be a very big problem, and you have to put so much resources sometimes to get Dark Magicians into graveyard, into your hand, that it can be very troublesome. Also, why is Dragoon not in the game yet? Just come on, add Dragoon, Konami. We need Dragoon. Next is Aromatherapy. Aromatherapy is a deck all about gaining life points and getting additional effects off the fact that you've gained life points. It's a cool archetype, but unfortunately it's just not very good anymore. There's random burn effects that can totally throw your deck off. The positive thing is a lot of the Aromatherapy cards, or some of the Aromatherapy cards, like Aromatherapy Jasmine, is now played in other plant decks, and in those decks, yeah, you should play those decks instead of playing a pure Aromatherapy deck. But if you like the deck, listen, I always tell people, you can play whatever you want. I'm just giving you the raw information. Kawaki Meru is a terrible archetype, but some of the rock Kawaki Meru monsters are really good in Adamemancipator, so play that. Next is Trap Trick. Trap Trick is probably like, it's actually probably a pretty good deck right now, if I'm being honest with you. It's probably the higher end of Rogue. If you go first, you usually win with this deck, because it's one of those decks where it's one of the best going first decks of all time. It doesn't have any dark monsters or light monsters whatsoever. The entire archetype is Earth, so Bestials do nothing against this deck. And on top of that, yeah, just all of those things that I said, it just has trouble going second sometimes. And the other positive part about this deck is it's not at full power. We have a structure deck that has released in the TCG and OCG at this point months ago, like almost like 4 or 5 months ago. That has released in the TCG many months ago, and the deck is actually quite strong. Honestly, it's a very strong deck. It was instantly playable, and I think when it hits Master Duel, it'll be in the same situation. When it will hit Master Duel is another story, but it's definitely probably higher end of Rogue in this meta right now. Next is Phantom Knights. I'd say kind of like mid-Rogue. It's one of those decks that just is not in a great place right now with Tyramids running around. Tyramids is just the better deck automatically, so it's a combo deck, and Tyramids is just the better graveyard focused combo deck than Phantom Knights. Phantom Knights is another deck that's heavily negatively influenced by Beastie / its use shufflers, and if everybody's playing those, this deck is going to have a significant amount of trouble. Next is Dragoonity. Pure Dragoonity, I don't think you should play. Like, by playing Pure Dragoonity, you do have access to some cool synchro monsters, but honestly, Dragon Link is just the better deck to play. I'm not going to put this in consider building something else because I don't think it's bad enough to be here. It is a good deck, it's just I don't think it's as good as Dragon Link. And in Dragon Link, you play a lot of the Dragoonity monsters, like Romulus. You can even play Remus, because Remus, you can discard to search Dragon's Ravine. You can play a lot of different stuff like that. It's actually quite good. So, yeah, I'd say probably just play a lot of... You can play a Dragon Link deck and just up the amount of Dragoonity monsters that you include, and then it's still a very strong deck. So definitely I would say Dragon Link is probably the better deck to play. Next is... these are the Live Twin Evil Twins. Good deck, but again, it's one of those decks that's heavily negatively influenced by the... Beastials, because the Beastials absolutely wreck this deck. The best monsters are, I believe they're light and dark. I don't remember what exactly. They're either light or dark, but it's the Kisakil and the Leela, the Link monsters, the Link 2s that are in the graveyard, and then you've got the Link 4 also, and I believe they're all light or dark. I don't remember what it is, but they're either light or dark monsters, and that is essentially like most of the grind game of this deck, is being able to summon those on command. So that can be a little bit of an issue. You could play this with Sprites, which used to be a tier 1 deck, like Sprite with Live Twin Sprite used to be a tier 1 deck, but again, as long as Beastials exist, this part of the engine is just a little bit not quite as good. Now, the good thing about Sprites is most of the attributes of the regular Sprites are all over the place. So you have like Carrot and, yeah, you have Carrot and the other one, Red, Carrot. Those two aren't even light and dark, so the Beastials just don't affect those two cards. So that is a cool aspect. Right now, at this point, pure Sprites is significantly better than Live Twin Sprites. Now, if for example, Tyramids get hit more so and Beastials fall out of the metagame, then I believe that it is possible that this version will come back up here somewhere, but as of right now, I think it's in Rogue. Next is, oh my god, this deck is another one. It's like, it's in the same situation where, it's in the same situation of like, it's almost in the same situation as Lightsworn and Phantom Knights, where it's just, this is Burning Abyss. It's almost in the same situation as those two decks, where it's just like, it's tier limit, but it's worse than tier limit. It's almost like a tier limit from a past metagame, where the entire objective of the deck is to mill stuff, and then you get effects when things hit the graveyard. Cool playstyle, but literally tier limits does that better than Burning Abyss ever did, and I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Next, this deck got hit indirectly because this is Noble Knights or Ignoble Knights, the synchro versions of the Noble Knight monsters. This deck recently got hit, not because the Konami's trying to hit this deck, but because it was trying to hit something else. But Smoke Grenade of the Thief got hit, and that was like one of the main ways that this deck was played. And I'd say it's probably somewhere at the bottom of Rogue. It's like a decent Rogue deck, nothing too crazy. Zombies is probably tier 3. This is a deck that is actually quite good, and it's good against tier limits because Zombie World changes all of their attributes into zombie, and then they no longer have any aqua monsters in the graveyard because all of the graveyard monsters are zombie, but if they, and on the field, so it can kind of sometimes hinder them from fusion summoning, but remember the ones in the hand are still aqua monsters. So it's a little bit, it can make tier limit have awkward plays occasionally. So the deck has a good matchup against a lot of decks. So it has like a good matchup against Dragon Link because it turns all the dragons into zombies. It has a good matchup against Philanderies because it turns Philanderies is just like an auto win against Philanderies because it turns all of their birds into zombies, and then they can't tribute summon unless they're tribute summoning a zombie, which is what Zombie World says. So it's good against a lot of decks. It can have semi-good matchups against tier limits. It does nothing against Sprite. It does nothing against Despia. It does nothing against Exo Sisters. Labyrinth, it can have some good matchups. It can have some good situations with because these are no longer rocks. Like, it has some good matchup against some decks, but it's like 50-50. And yeah, I'd say the deck is like, it just depends on who you're playing against, but it can be very, very good sometimes. And it can easily, it's one of those decks that, depending on which version you play, can have a very high ceiling, but I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. Nothing too crazy, but yeah, I'd say probably around tier 3. Now, the negatives of the deck is, again, Beastie's very good against this deck because they can just banish, Doom King Ballardrock right before, like as soon as activate in the standby phase, Beastie. Never fun. Next is Sword Soul. Sword Soul is actually quite good right now. I'd say Sword Soul is probably tier 2. It's incredible how long this deck has remained tier 2. Yeah, definitely a very strong deck. It has, I wouldn't say that it has like a good matchup against any of the top tier decks, but it's very consistent in what it does. And the Beastials are actually really, really good in this deck because it's basically a free level 6 monster. And level 6 monsters are actually quite key in this deck because you have a variety of different things that are really positive here. You have, let's say you summon a Bestial monster, it's level 6, banish your opponent's monster. On the follow-up, the tokens in this archetype are level 4 monsters that are tuners. So level 6 plus level 4 lets you get to Baron de Fleur. Very good for that reason. The other cool thing is you have like Adhara, for example, which is the you have Adhara, which is the Tenyi monster. You can summon that. You have your Beastial. Level 1 plus level 6 tuner, non-tuner lets you go into Yazi, level 7. Really good. Another cool thing is you have the Beastials. Let's say you summon a Beastial, your opponent continues to play, gets to your turn, your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can summon an Incredible Ecclesia. Incredible Ecclesia is level 4. Level 4 plus a Beastial, automatic, without even committing a normal summon, automatic Baron de Fleur. And you still have your normal summon to do whatever you want with, so you can go on to summon Moyi and, you know, Xiao Fang and all the other stuff. So like the Beastials are actually really, really good in this archetype because it gives you a body on board that's level 6 and then you can synchro summon with it. So really awesome, gives you really cool plays to go into. I'd say it's definitely like a tier 2 deck, and it's continued to have representation in almost every single tournament because the deck is just so consistent. Like, again, it's one of those decks, it's not a high ceiling. This is the interesting part about this deck. Like Philanderies and Sword Soul and like Sprite to a certain degree, where the deck doesn't have as high of a ceiling as, like, for example, DDDs or Dragon Link or even Spirals. It doesn't have as high of a ceiling as these decks, but it's so consistent that it will 100% get to a better, it'll 100% of the, almost 100% of the time, unless your opponent has like 3 hand traps, it will almost 100% of the time get to a Baron de Fleur plus a Blackout plus a Xiao Fang. It'll basically get to those 3 things every single time, and then it'll have like a hand trap or 2 hand traps in hand for the follow-up. And then oftentimes the Sword Soul engine is so consistent that you can even search a follow-up in the same turn. So you have like a Moyi available in hand. So it's just a really, 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 really consistent deck, and for those reasons, still in tier 2, despite being meta relevant for almost like, let's say like 9, maybe 10 months. Like, really good. Next is Kairu Shin Control. I'd say it's probably like a bottom of tier 3 deck. It just continues to get hit in like the weirdest ways, like side hits. So it lost Terraforming, just the last ban list, and before then it lost Foolish Burial Goods, which Foolish Burial Goods was a pretty big hit because it prevents Ice Barrier from getting sent to the graveyard. Now you can replace, you have to alter the deck entirely, where now you have to play Reasonings and stuff like that in order to mill a bunch of stuff to the graveyard. So the deck is significantly less consistent than it used to be, which is a bit frustrating, but it's not that the ceiling dropped on the deck. Like the deck has the same, like a very similar ceiling to what it used to have. And the deck, it's a control deck, but it's very good at breaking boards. Like it can break a full Dragon Link board. You resolve Legendary Ocean, your opponent's like, no problem, Legendary Ocean, I guess it doesn't hurt my board, yeah, go ahead. And then you normal summon Kairu Shin, it outs an entire board of your opponents, which is just, it's unbelievable. This deck has a very, very, very good, it's for a combo deck, not for a combo deck, for a control deck. Legendary Ocean is a very, very good deck for breaking boards. And then for going first, it's obviously very good because Kairu Shin plus the Jellyfish, plus like Sea Stealth attack. Again, it's only like 3 cards, but that board is very tough to break because you have a negate, a floodgate, and protection. Those 3 things alone will basically beat the majority of the cards in the metagame. Now, one more positive about this deck is that the Beastios do nothing against this deck because you don't play any lights or dark, so they're just dead cards. And the negative, probably the biggest negative of this deck is, although it's good against every one of these decks right here, and it's really good against Sword Soul because it modifies their level and it reduces the Moi's level and the token's level by 1, for example, and it makes it very tough to play Sword Soul against this deck. Although it has a great matchup against every one of these decks right here, it actually doesn't have a great matchup against the most represented and best deck in the game, which is Tyramids. Unfortunately, Tyramids, it's a predominantly dark archetype, but it has a lot of water monsters. Like some of the boss monsters are water, some of the combo starters like Reinhardt are water. So for those reasons, it can easily play around Kairu Shin, and it can easily out Kairu Shin and then just continue playing. It's such an awkward situation where the deck is so good against all of the metagame. It's good against all of the decks that are good against Tyramid. It's good against the majority of decks that have ever come out, but it just so happens to be at the exact same time where Tyramid is the best deck, and Tyramid really actually has a very good matchup against the Kairu Shin deck. As a matter of fact, most of the time when you play Legendary Ocean and you play against Tyramids, whether you win the coin flip or you lose the coin flip, most of the time you'll actually just lose to Tyramids because it's not even, they just have such a good matchup against this deck where the main gimmick of the deck and main floodgate doesn't really hurt them that much. So that's why it is tier 3, but if you basically play against anybody else, you usually can win the duel. Next is Sylvan. I'm going to put this in Consider Building Something Else. It's one of those plant decks that, again, plant has basically become almost like zombies and dinosaurs, where you don't play individual plant archetypes, you just play like, here is a big pile of plants and I'm going to play this and I'm going to win. Like, so it's probably Consider Building Something Else. Your best bet is probably Rika or like Plant Link. So don't play this, play one of those 2 decks. Next is Dinomorphia. Dinomorphia is probably like a rogue. Let's say like a rogue. Yeah, it's probably like a rogue archetype. Like a rogue dinosaur deck. It's a trap-based dinosaur deck that continues to pay half its life points until it gets really, really low. And then it has some good cards like Rembrandt, which is their boss monster. It has Teresia, which is really good. Like, it has some really good cards, but it's a little bit weak if we're being honest. Thunder Dragon is the second best Thunder archetype. What this deck really needs is it needs Colossus. Without Colossus, this deck will never really be. It needs 3 Colossus. Until Colossus goes to 3, this deck will never be what it used to be. Because this deck used to be insane, but ever since Colossus got hit, this deck's just sort of fallen off. Yeah, Colossus at 1 is just not strong enough for the deck, unfortunately. Like, if this deck could summon 3 Colossus, now that would be like threatening, because then it's like, okay, I'm not going to be able to search out 3 monsters. But the problem is that's, while that is really threatening, it's also kind of toxic, and it prevents a lot of decks from playing. Next is Invoked. This deck is completely and totally fallen off. It's an obscure rogue deck now. Despia is in every single way a better fusion deck, and Tyramids is in every single way a better fusion deck than Despia, which is a better fusion deck than Invoked. Also, just the Beastials wreck this deck because you just banish Alistair, unfortunately. You activate Invocation, Bestial Magnum, banish Alistair. Have fun. Next is the Birds, which is definitely like a higher tier rogue deck. It's a good rogue deck, but I wouldn't say it's like broken by any means. What is good about this deck, and not only this deck, but Tri-Brigades, is that they don't have quite as many dark monsters, so it's a little bit tough for your opponent to Bestial their way out of it. Bestial their way into a free win, basically. This deck really needs the Barrier Statue back, though, because without it, it's a little tough. Salamangreats is a good deck to play right now. It's all 100% fire. So if your opponent's devoting a bunch of spots to Bestials and your entire deck is fire, that's actually really good. They've cut DD Crows, for example, and replaced them with Bestials, which is awesome, because Gazelle used to be a prime DD Crow target, but now Gazelle doesn't get banished, so it's actually quite good. So it's definitely one of the higher end rogue decks, probably somewhere actually up here. A really good rogue deck to play right now. Next is Scareclaw. Scareclaw is like an okay rogue deck to play. I wouldn't recommend it. Tri-Brigade Scareclaw, as far as Scareclaws goes, probably the best version. Sky Striker is in a really, really rough position. It's probably like somewhere around here. Between the Ichizu Shufflers and the Bestials, this deck is just very tough to play, because the Ichizu Shufflers can shuffle back spells and then make sure that you never have 3 spells in the graveyard, which is very, very tough to play through. And then Bestials are probably just one of the most like super effective cards against Sky Strikers, because they can just banish your Ray or your Rose, and then it kills your entire like grind game. It kills linkage. Like it's just a really, really bad situation for Sky Strikers. I wouldn't recommend playing this in this particular metagame. This is another deck that probably the second best ritual deck we have available. This deck is really good, but the issue with this, the issue with Drytron is that it's just not. The Drytron cards activate in the graveyard, which is just not a great. Again, Bestials just destroy the graveyard, and they're all light monsters that activate in the graveyard. So although it's better than playing like Cyber Angels or the majority of ritual archetypes, I just don't think it's the right metagame to play it right now. Utopia is another deck that's just I think that the ceiling on this deck is actually quite high, but sometimes it's just a little bit too easy to stop Utopia. So I'd probably say it's somewhere in the bottom half of Rogue. This is a Gladiator Beast. Gladiator Beast is a deck that doesn't have that high of a ceiling, but also doesn't have very high combo potential. The best way to play this is to mix it with Tri-Brigades, and yeah, it's probably the best version that you could possibly come up with, although pure Tri-Brigade is probably just better. While I'm here, pure Tri-Brigade is probably at the upper half of Rogue, somewhere up here. Not the best deck right now by any means. Very low combo ceiling. Very easy to set up, but low combo ceiling. It doesn't really end on much. It's like an Appaloosa, maybe a Dragon Lords, and yeah, Appaloosa, Dragon Lords, and like Revolt face down. That is the entire, like, okay, you managed to summon that, but it's not really that good. It's very consistent, but not really that good. Plunder Patrol is probably somewhere in the higher half of Rogue. It's a very cool archetype that basically equips ships to itself. It's a cool archetype. I'd say, yeah, probably higher half of Rogue is more than fair placement for it. This is Goatee / Sharks. Did I put Goatee on here? I think I did previously. It's got to be floating around here somewhere. Goatee's somewhere around here. Yeah, I'd say this is probably, we're going to count this as Goatee / Sharks, and Goatee / Sharks is actually a pretty cool rogue deck. It doesn't matter about getting banished, because the whole point of the deck is to get banished anyway, so I'd say it's probably somewhere around the high end of Rogue. Next is Orcus, this deck continues to get things off the ban list, but it couldn't get things off the ban list at a worse time because Bastials are so good against this deck. It is like annoying how good Bastials are against this deck, because obviously the entire archetype is all dark. So really annoying to banish your stuff. The whole point of this deck is you have to have stuff in the graveyard, but unfortunately with the Bastials, it's tough to do that. Next we've got this is Unchained. Unchained is, I'd say, probably like a mid-tier rogue deck. It's getting new support in the TCG in like I don't even know it. I probably in like 3 months in the TCG, and maybe like I want to say like 6 months in Master Duel, but who knows? The deck will get better, but not right now. Amazement is a trap-based archetype that's pretty cool. It's all about equipping trap cards to your monsters and your opponent's monsters. You get different effects based on who you equip it to. Cool archetype, but honestly, it's just not as good as other trap decks. Without a doubt, the best trap deck is still Labyrinth. Followed by Eldlich, but Eldlich is in a really, really bad place right now with the Bastials running around. But this is probably around Rogue. Not that great, but not that bad either. Next is Virtual World. It's probably somewhere in the higher half of Rogue. What's cool about this deck is that it's almost all wind. So you don't have to stress about Bastials whatsoever. They just sit in your opponent's hand, which is really cool. It's in that same place as Salamangreats, where it's like really cool that Bastials, a hand trap that everybody's playing, doesn't affect your deck, but the deck has been hit in so many different ways that it's actually hurt the deck too much for it to be like really, really good. Next is Ghost Strike. I'd say this is avoided at all costs or consider building something else. It's just honestly not that good of an archetype. It's a flip-based archetype. To a certain degree, it's a flip face-up, not flip as in like the flip effect monster. It's like a flip face-up deck that is probably somewhere in, yeah, it's somewhere in here, but it's just not as good like as Subterra, for example. Marin Cess is another deck that I think is in the same situation that Salamangreats and Virtual World are, where Bastials don't hurt this deck in any conceivable fashion whatsoever. So for those reasons, it's actually significantly good. But the issue with it is it's just not as good as, it doesn't have as good of a combo potential as some of the other decks that are up here. Like it ends on a monster, it's unaffected by stuff, and then you can negate a spawn trap card and summon a monster from your what is it called, from your back row. Like that's all cool and all, but it's just, and then on top of it you have searchable imperms, like what are they called, searchable imperm with Marincess Wave. With all of that is cool, but it's just not really that much it's not that much of a combo potential. It is very easy to set up, it's very consistent, but it's just not really all that great. Earth Machines are a good deck. It's probably, again, in that same situation, high rogue, where it's very good. Again, it's very good because you don't have a lot of dark monsters in the deck, because the only dark monster you have is Ruin Force, and that's it. All of your other monsters are all Earth. They're Earth Machines. So for that reason, that's actually quite good. But there's some cards that we're still missing that were actually leaked a long time ago. There's like a new card that I forget its name. I don't know why I'm forgetting the name, but it turns all of your monsters, all of the monsters on the field and in the graveyards, into machines. It's almost like a zombie world, but it's a continuous spell for machines. It's like a zombie world, but it's for machines. And that card, again, we're just waiting for it to come out, and it hasn't come out, and it needs to come out to make that deck better. Next we've got, these are the Mech Knights. A good deck overall, but I just don't think it's the best meta to play it. It's a going second deck, but it's just not really all that strong right now. Next is Weather Painters. This is another, it's a really cool concept for this deck. Weather Painters, basically, it makes it so your back row, it turns the effects of your back row, it puts the effects of your back row onto the monsters that you have on the field, which is pretty cool, that are lined up in the same columns. Like, it's a very, very cool concept for a deck, but it's not particularly the strongest deck that's available out there. It relies very heavily on floodgates like Skill Drain, which have been limited severely, and as the floodgates get more and more limited, this deck will just continue to move down and down into obscurity. Next is Cyber. I don't know why I said Cyber. I mean, I guess it's because it's Cyber / Harpy, but it's Harpy Ladies. This deck is a bottom end rogue deck. The problem with this deck right now is it's very good at getting to a rank 4 toolbox, but that's not particularly relevant right now. Other than like summoning Abyss Dweller It doesn't really matter to get to a rank 4 toolbox. You can get to a Beastie or a Baguska, but again, it's like that really all that great. On top of that, the deck is very good at dealing with back row, but again, like look up here, there's not a lot of back row decks in the top half of this. As a matter of fact, most people have actually cut a lot of the back row moves. So in all honesty, the deck has kind of fallen off quite a bit. Next is Runic. Runic is still an annoying deck to deal with. I'd probably say it's at the very, very, very top of Rogue. Honestly, I could probably squeeze it into tier 3. It's just a very, very annoying deck to deal with, and the entire point of the deck is to banish your opponent's deck, essentially. And sometimes what's good about this, about playing this deck, is sometimes there's a lot of decks right now that mill themselves. Like for example, Tyramids. So they already drop the amount of cards that you have in the deck. And while they drop the amount of cards they have in their deck, it makes it even easier to basically finish them off with Runics, because you have less cards to have to banish. So the deck can be very good, but it's definitely not as good as when it was in its heyday and it was super annoying. Naturia is a good deck. It's probably somewhere around here. Sacred Tree is a broken card. They released a new support for this. Naturia Runic is a good deck, but unfortunately it hasn't seen like a ton of representation. I'd probably say it's somewhere on the top half of Rogue. It's a good deck, but not like an outrageously great deck. Madolche is another deck. I'd say it's top half of Rogue material, perfect, because it's like it's a deck that it's a deck that's really benefited from the last few months. The Vernus Loops are really good in Madolche's. It's all Earth, so the Bestials do nothing against it. It can main deck a lot of Floodgates that like goes in match, that like it negatively only impacts other people. Like it's a good meta call in this meta game right now. Like all of these right here are just all attributes that are not negatively affected by Bestials, so they're all great meta calls right now. They're just rogue decks that are really good against essentially a lot of the stuff that's playing Bestials. Next is this is Mermills and stuff. It's one of those decks that it has an extremely high combo ceiling potential, but sometimes it can be a little bit too easy to stop, and that's why I'd say it's probably in Rogue. Cleaveforts is another like Pendulum tribute summoning archetype, probably somewhere around the latter half of Rogue. It's decent, but I wouldn't recommend it, especially since skill drains at 1. Fluffles, unfortunately, are a deck that got hit 2 ban lists ago because it lost Foolish Burial of Goods, and that card was actually quite integral to the deck, and it's frustrating that it got hit, but it's the reality of the situation. Next we've got Red Eyes. Red Eyes is a deck that is severely hit by the Bestials. But if you want to play Red Eyes, I would recommend playing some of the Red Eyes cards in a Dragon Link deck, and that's probably the best way to play Red Eyes right now. Next we've got, this is a deck that I don't recommend you play, which is Artifacts. Artifacts is not a good deck. It basically is all about having your opponent, if your opponent pops your back row, you get to special summon them, and then you get to trigger additional effects. Like I said, most people have pretty much cut Harpy's Feather Duster, Lightning Storm, all of that stuff, because back row is just so irrelevant right now because most of the floodgates got hit. So the chances of your opponent just randomly popping your back row and you going off is just not there. Cosmos is a good deck, not a great deck, I'd say. The problem with it is it just absolutely dies to Ash. It's a pre-Ash archetype, so when you get Ashed, you essentially lose. It's probably middle of Rogue. This is Speedroid. Speedroids is a cool deck. I'd say it's probably at the higher half of Rogue right now, because again, the entire deck is all wind monsters. So if your opponent's main decking Bestials and all this stuff, it literally does nothing against you, so it can really be beneficial in that regard. Next we've got, this is Blackluster Soldier. It's a deck that is waiting on more support. Its new support is just 1 card, but it does actually significantly help the deck. Overall, I don't think that this card is that great. In terms of a ritual archetype, I recommend you play something else, and the archetype that I recommend that you play is Dogmatica, if you want to play a ritual deck. Shiranui is a deck that I always say, don't play pure Shiranui. I don't think it's that good. The problem with pure Shiranui is it's just very tough to like get started. It's very tough to load up the graveyard with Shiranui monsters. Like once you put them in the graveyard and you start playing, like the deck is actually really good. But the problem with this deck is it shares a similar issue to like Element Sabers, where it can be very tough to put the Shiranui monsters in the graveyard, but once they're there, the deck is actually quite good. So I would recommend instead just playing pure zombies, not pure zombies, like Zombie World, and then you can play some of the Shiranui monsters. This is another terrible deck. Consider building something else, or don't play it at all. This is Vehicroids, which were used by Cyrus in the anime Roids. It's just not good. It's a machine-based archetype that the ceiling on this deck is just so low. Like, by all definitions and accounts, this deck is just so power crept, it's unbelievable. It was power crept when it came out. That's how bad this is. Like, the deck is just such a weak deck. I don't think it has any negates. It just has a bunch of, like, just big monsters that are hard to summon that don't do anything. They're like piercing. It's like, okay, great, thanks. I'm so glad my monster in 2023 has piercing. I can't wait to attack a monster in defense mode and do 300 damage. It's just such a power crept archetype. It's unreal. Next is Magician Girls. This is another avoid at all costs. It's just one of those decks that's just, it's just not strong. And honestly, pure Dark Magician is better than playing the Dark Magician Girls. The only Dark Magician Girl that's actually good is Chocolate Magician Girl, and it's not even that good. Next is True Dracos. It's a deck that I wouldn't say is like got hit. I think it just got power crept. And on top of getting power crept, as the floodgates get hit more and more and more, this deck just becomes weaker and weaker and weaker, and it fades more into obscurity. Blacklist, no, this is not Blacklist. Bluster Blader as a deck is an okay deck. It can basically turn your opponent's monsters into dragons and then essentially stop them from activating monster effects, changing them to defense mode. Those effects are all good and fine. The issue is, it's just going second with this deck can be a little rough. Going first is great. Going second is like, it's one of those decks that just going second, sometimes you just can't do anything because you have to set up a trap card that basically lets you fusion summon and then summon a Buster Dragon during your opponent's turn to kind of like lock your opponent out of the game. But if you're going second, can't do any of that. So Rogue it is. This is Digital Bugs. Probably consider building something else. It's just not that great of an archetype, and definitely Crawlers are the better flip insect deck. Next is Paleozoics, severely hit on the ban list and really, really bad. The Choose the Shufflers wrecked this deck, and this deck really needs Totally Awesome. And it doesn't only need Totally Awesome, it needs 3 Totally Awesomes. Totally Awesome needs to come back. They need to hit something else in Sprites to make Totally Awesome come back for this deck to be good. Next is, this is 8-axis. 8-axis is what it's called. It's like basically a rank 8 OTK deck. It's a very strong deck, but the issue with this deck is it just doesn't, going second is just really rough in Master Duel, especially with Max C and the Chizu Shufflers and all of the other stuff that you have to deal with. The good thing about this deck is you can main deck things like Dimensional Shifter, but overall I'd say it's probably like higher end of Rogue. Exodia, don't play Exodia. Exodia is just, it's just not a good deck to play most of the time. Again, Exodia is one of those decks where if you go first, you sometimes win. If you go second, you never win. So I'd say it's probably avoided at all costs. Spellbooks is a cool deck. It's a decent deck. I'd say the best way to play it is to mix it with Dogmatica and create the Dogmatica ritual deck with Spellbooks. Probably the best way to play that. Crusadia OTK is probably like a Rogue, bottom half of Rogue deck. You just don't see it like at all. You never see it. It's a great budget deck, but it's just not that great when you consider the combo potential to literally anything else in the metagame right now. Prank Kids is a deck that is good against, it's like, I'd say it's probably at the higher half of Rogue, where it's like all of the attributes of Prank Kids are water and earth, and like water, earth, wind, stuff like that. Water, earth, wind, and fire. So it's all of those 4 attributes, but it's not light and dark, so Bystials do nothing against it. In those regards, that's really good, but overall, I'd say it's probably like a higher end Rogue deck. It's just been severely hit with its Meow Meow going to 1. It's just a little bit rough for the deck. This is another deck that's quite good as a Rogue deck. It's Zodiacs. It can go second. You can play D-Shifter. You can go first. You can play Macrocosm. You can play cards like that because those cards are really, really good. And then you just make a, you can attack directly with Borbo, and then you can make a 10 material Zeus and then send all your opponent's stuff to the graveyard. So the deck can be very good, but it's a little bit simple. Next is, this is Endymion. I'm going to put Endymion next to exactly where I put other Pendulum, like beyond Pendulums, like a full Pendulum Magician deck. This Endymion is probably the best way to play Pendulums, honestly. This is an avoid at all costs or consider building something else. This is Dreamir, really cool archetype in terms of design, really cool idea, but unfortunately in practice the archetype is just a little too weak. Next is, this is, what is it, Trap Tricks. This is a repeat, I already said this. This is Ancient Gears. I'd say it's probably consider building something else. It's just too weak. Like, honestly, you have to put like 4 materials into one monster, and then your opponent outs that monster and you lose. Like, the monster's just not good enough. It's definitely a consider building something else, and what I would consider you should consider building is Earth Machines. It's just much better, and you get to use some of the you get to use like Gear Frame, and you get to use the the Search card, the Gear Frame. You could still use some of the Ancient Gear cards. It's just not, Ancient Gears as a pure deck going second, it's just not really that strong unless you're in like Silver tier, for example. Then you can go have fun. Symphonics are at the bottom of Rogue. I don't think it's a good deck at all. It has some cool combos with 2 cards you can end on like 3-4 negates, but they're two very specific cards, unfortunately. Next is Libromancer. It's another ritual-based archetype. It's a cool engine, but it's attached to rituals, and rituals are like really slow. And like I said before, the best ritual deck is Dogmatica. Next is ABC, severely destroyed by the Beastials because they're all lights and you have to have them in graveyard. If you don't have them in graveyard, then you can't make Buster Dragon. If you can't make Buster Dragon, you literally cannot play. The deck does nothing. So it's probably at the bottom half of Rogue. Next is Earth Machine / Trains. Trains probably right. I'll put it right next to Machinas because that's probably I would say you play the archetypes together. So next is Pure Therion. Don't play Pure Therion. Play Therion with other stuff, because with other stuff it's really good. By itself it's really not that good of an archetype. This is Slifer. Building a Slifer deck is almost impossible because there's no way to search Slifer, unfortunately. This is a higher end of Rogue deck. This is Punks. Actually, I would say put it in tier 3. Punks are a very good deck. They have a great ceiling and they're very, very consistent. That's what I love about Punks. Like, they're such a consistent archetype, and their attributes are kind of all over the place, which is really cool. The issue with the Punks is that sometimes you're gonna have a little bit of trouble playing right now, just because the ceiling of these decks is just a lot higher than Punks. But it's a very consistent deck nevertheless. Dark Magician I've already reviewed. This is the deck that's waiting for support. I'm going to put it in the bottom of Rogue, but this is one of those decks that will get better because there's a structure deck announced. And by this deck, I mean Red Dragon Resonator as a deck. Like, it's a good deck, but it's one of those decks that's going to get more support later. Right now, it's just you end on the Red Nova Supremacy monster, but it's just not quite enough. Final Countdown is a deck I would avoid because I'm pretty sure Final Countdown is limited to 1, so don't play it. Next is Grand Maju. Grand Maju is a cool OTK deck. I'd say if you're going to play Grand Maju, play a Floodgate Grand Maju deck with 3 Macrocosmos, 3-Dimensional Fissure, basically throw a bunch of cards that prevent your opponent from playing, and then Grand Maju, and then you attack directly and hopefully win. So that's what I would recommend. And then we've got Winged Dragon of Ra is probably a very, very bottom of Rogue deck. Unfortunately, it's one of those decks that, again, it's just the combo potential on this deck is non-existent. You just summon Winged Dragon of Ra, and if your opponent gives you a paper cut, you lose because you have to pay everything but 100 life points. Gem Knights is a cool deck. I'd say it's probably like a bottom half of Rogue. Unfortunately, with this deck, its best cards are limited or banned. They're gone off the ban list, like Brilliant Fusion, so I'd say probably Rogue is where it's going to stay until some of those move. Relinquished is consider building something else. Unfortunately, losing Instant Fusion is frustrating for this deck. I've already reviewed this. This is a repeat. This is Witchcrafters. Witchcrafters is like a bottom Rogue deck. It's one of those decks that, like, it seems good on paper, but it doesn't. Like, you can mill 20 cards and it doesn't even do anything. Like, it's such a sad deck. Like, this deck has one of the lowest ceilings I've ever seen on a deck. Like, the best case scenario for this is like you have a monster that pops a card, and then you have a monster that negates monsters your opponent controls, but it only activates once, and it negates them once while on the field, and then like that's just not really all that great. It has a very, very low ceiling. That's the problem with that deck. So this is not Sylvan's. This is I'm going to count this as Plant Link. So Plant Link is probably somewhere in the higher half of Rogue. This is just a combination of a bunch of different plant cards. And it's actually quite a good deck. And you basically end on a Cactus Bouncer, and yeah, you beat your opponent like that. This is Ancient Warriors. It's like a middle second half, like the top half of Rogue. Ancient Warriors is a good OTK going second deck. It's a strong deck, and the problem with this deck is, again, it needs the special summon and it has to go second, so it's like there are inherent disadvantages in both of those things. So it's probably at the higher half of Rogue. The good thing is that it's not negatively affected by Beastials, so that's cool. Next is Ichizu. You don't play Ichizu purely, but Ichizu is good in a lot of different archetypes, and obviously it's very good, but it's very bad as a pure deck. You don't play it as a pure deck, particularly since everything got hit on the ban list. This is G-Golem. G-Golem you can mix with either Mathmex, or you can mix it with Salamangrates, and it takes certain things away from them. It raises their ceilings, like it makes them better, but it makes them more bricky. So you trade off consistency for better end boards. So it really depends on you. Next is Sue Ships. This deck has continued to be one of the best investments for the events, but as a pure deck, it's just a little bit too weak, and they're getting actually more cards too, from what I remember. Crawlers is the best flip archetype other than Subterror, so it's the second best flip archetype, but it's better than Digital Bugs. This is Skull Servants. I'd say Skull Servants are probably like bottom half of Rogue. It's very good. Sometimes it's a very conditional deck. It's cool when you play it in the Ichizu. It sucks playing against the Ichizu cards because they can shuffle your Skull Servant stuff back, but it's cool sometimes because your opponent can mill your stuff, but your stuff doesn't trigger when it hits the graveyard. It needs to remain in the graveyard, so that can be a little bit of a tough situation. Next, and a lot of them are, yeah, it's a tough situation. Next, this is one of the better decks, this is Rika's. Rika's is a very good deck right now. It's a water plant archetype. It's probably in the higher half of tier 3. One of the best decks in the game. It's the best plant deck in the game. The field spell is really good. It's like a better version of Lair of Darkness, which is automatically just really, really good. Next is one of the worst structure decks we've had so far, which is Gaia. I like this archetype personally. The problem is it's just not very meta relevant, and although it hurts to say, and I like it, again, I like it personally, the problem is it's just not really that great of an archetype. Just because it's a going second deck that needs to special summon like 4 or 5 times, and if your opponent max sees you, you essentially lose, and it doesn't really have a lot of protection for itself. So you're trying to OTK, you're playing a bunch of board breakers. You can't play stuff like Evenly Matched, which is the best going second card, because you lose your battle phase and then you can't OTK. Like, there's a lot of inherent issues to this card. This is Numerons. Numerons are in the worst state they've ever been in. Just because the Ichizu stuff just absolutely wrecks this deck, because it makes you mill, and sometimes you mill like Numeron networks and stuff like that. On top of that, the problem with Numeron right now is that the best decks in the game have a really good grind game, so you probably will not OTK them. Like, Numerons will not OTK most of the time, will not OTK tier limits, and if you don't OTK with this deck, you don't win. You won't OTK Despia because, again, they can revive their monsters in the graveyard. Luber, you can revive the guy that burns for 600. You can revive him from the graveyard. There's very easy ways to revive stuff, and if you don't OTK with this deck, you essentially don't win. Also, like, yeah, any deck that has a really good grind game just automatically destroys Numerons, unfortunately. Destiny board, don't play Destiny board. It sucks. It's just a really bad deck. This is was Synchrons. Synchrons are a deck that isn't particularly bad. The problem with this deck is if they stop Junk Speeder, this deck is worthless. Like, it's almost impossible to play this deck if they stop Junk Speeder. It's such an unfortunate part of the deck where Junk Speeder is so important to the deck that it's unplayable without it. But like if Junk Speeder resolves, you win. If Junk Speeder gets negated, you lose. Like it's such a sad situation. Next is Amazoness, cool deck, but honestly, it needs more floodgates to be like Goes in Match needs to be a 3, Rivalry needs to be a 3, and this deck would be significantly better. But in its current state, it's just kind of like it almost feels like a deck from like 2008 reincarnated into 2023, and it's a little bit on the weak side. Vernisloofs, I wouldn't recommend playing Vernisloofs pure. I'd recommend blending them with some kind of deck, like for example, Earth Machines or Redolces or something like that, or these are the Naturias. I recommend mixing the Vernisloofs with other decks, but don't play them pure, and these are all repeats. So if there are any decks that I missed, actually I remember one I missed, so I'm going to count this right now as Dogmatica, the Ritual Dogmatica deck. I think the Ritual Dogmatica deck, I believe, is a tier 3 deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere in the higher half of tier 3. That deck is actually quite good. Obviously, I forgot to put it on the list, but I'm talking about it now. It's a really, really good deck. It's very good against just general metagame. Its new Ritual monster, the one that's unaffected by monster summon from the extra deck, is super tough to out, and it's so easy to start the combo. And I think they moved the Dear Servant from 1 to 2, which is really good, and hopefully they move it from 2 to 3 because it really doesn't deserve to be on the ban list. That deck is actually really, really strong. It's definitely a tier 3 deck. But this is every deck that I could remember. If there are any decks that I missed, please let me know, and thank you for watching. La, 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 la.